Good day and welcome to Letters in Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The crime bill of 1994 is getting a lot of attention again after protests interrupted speaking events for both Hillary Clinton and former President Bill Clinton. Officially known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, it was the largest crime bill in U.S. history, providing funding for 100,000 new police officers, $9.7 billion in prisons, and $6.1 billion in prevention programs, and ranging in policy issues from expanding the death penalty and eliminating prisoner education programs to programs meant for violence against women protections and to curb access to assault weapons. As a bill, it was sponsored by former Democratic lawmakers, Representative Jack Brooks of Texas, and Senators Chuck Schumer of New York and Joe Biden of Delaware. It was signed into law by Bill Clinton, also worth noting Bernie Sanders, and a majority of the Congressional Black Caucus voted for it at the time. The law helped swell the prison population, and now in the Democratic primary it has become a political liability. Both Clintons have since expressed regret about some of the consequences of the bill, but along with others who supported the measure, say it was the best bill that they could get through Congress. And crime was so bad during the crack cocaine epidemic in urban areas around the country that people from these very areas, mostly black and Latino communities, wanted something to be done. In a recent commentary published by the New York Times called "Did Blacks Really Endorse the 1994 Crime Bill?" our guest today, Elizabeth Hinton, along with Julie Kohler-Hussman and Vesla M. Weaver, wrote this, quote, "There's no question that by the early 1990s, blacks wanted an immediate response to the crime, violence, and drug markets in their communities. But even at the time, many were asking for something different from the crime bill. Calls for tough sentencing and police protection were paired with calls for full employment, quality education, and drug treatment, and criticism of police brutality. Policymakers pointed to black support for greater punishment and surveillance without recognizing accompanying demands to redirect power and economic resources to low-income minority communities. When blacks ask for better policing, legislators tend to hear more instead." Today we are going to be in conversation about this history and how law enforcement, including surveillance and aggressive policing, began to intertwine with social programs meant to alleviate poverty in urban areas. This during Lyndon Johnson's Great Society push in the 1960s, another time of great social unrest. My guest is Elizabeth Hinton. She is assistant professor in the Department of History and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and she is the author of the book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. Elizabeth Hinton, it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. And let's begin by talking about the crime bill. And perhaps you can just describe to me what was happening around the country, the environment around the enactment and just the politics around this crime bill of 1994.
Well, as you mentioned, there was a great deal of violence and in low-income communities and residents who had succumbed to drug abuse and drug habits. At the same time, these practices were increasingly criminalized, not only by the national legislation of the Reagan administration, the 1984 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the 1988 Omnibus Anti-Drug Abuse Act, but also the increase of police and arrests and long sentences for drug-related offenses. So we have the introduction of mandatory minimum sentences in the 88 legislation, the disproportionate sentences for crack abuse versus powder cocaine possession, and there was a great deal of violence going on in the early 90s, but also these kind of assumptions that certain populations, what Hillary Clinton and others called super predators, were somehow innately violent and needed to be identified and incarcerated for long terms.
Can you tell me more about that term? And we've heard it before in recent coverage, especially around the protests around Hillary Clinton. Tell me more about that term, super predator.
So it comes from the criminologist Don DeLillo, and in several essays that he wrote, this idea that low-income youth, the implication is specifically black youth, are pathologically violent, that they commit crimes and acts of violence for their own kind of personal enjoyment, that they were a real threat to the public safety of the nation, and that there was no kind of means to rehabilitate them, that this group of the population needed to be identified and sentenced usually as adults to very, very long terms in prison, if not their entire lifetimes. And there was this sense that, the super predator, even though the term is kind of spatially and socioeconomically defined as low-income urban youth, the idea and the way even that it was evoked by Hillary Clinton is that, the super predators are kind of around the corner and could at any moment come and inflict violence on innocent Americans in rural, middle-class, suburban communities. So it really kind of generates this climate of fear. And of course, this is alongside the rise of crack cocaine abuse and the violence, drug trafficking, and gang warfare that accompanied that.
When was it coined? Was this the 90s or 80s or before?
Early 90s, I believe 92 or 93.
And I mentioned in my introduction that thanks to the crime bill, we've seen a swelling of the prison population. Perhaps you could tell me more about what we have seen in these past, 22 years since it was enacted.
Well, when Bill Clinton came to office, the infrastructure, the kind of criminal justice institutions at all levels of government had been well established. This is beginning with the Johnson administration, with the first kind of sets of national crime control policies. So when Clinton took office, he stepped into a process that was already well underway. But the 94 bill is perhaps, of all the federal legislation of the 30 years preceding it, the most kind of directly consequential for really setting off, exploding the U.S. prison population. The bill, as you said, it allocated $9.7 billion in prison construction, and the federal government agreed to cover 75% of the cost of these new prisons at the state level. So essentially, they're giving states a 75% off coupon to build prisons. They're incentivizing prisons, and at the same time, the legislation, with its three strikes provisions, really ensured that Americans, even who were convicted for nonviolent offenses, would serve very, very long time in prison. So not only did it expand the nation's prison population, but it ensured that those who had been ensnared in the system would spend a greater proportion of their lives in prison. And of course, in the age of super predators and the ways in which these policies targeted low-income Black and Latino youth, many of the people who were incarcerated during this period were in their teens and in their 20s.
Talk to me about the debate around the crime bill. And again, we've heard people say, well, people from the communities where the crime was rampant at the time supported this, wanted something done. Last week, in previewing the primary in New York, we spoke to Herb Boyd, who's a longtime journalist with the New York Amsterdam News, which is one of the oldest existing Black newspapers in the country. And he was saying, he was saying what young people don't remember today was how bad it was in the 80s and the 90s, and that something had to be done.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, part of the distinction of the article, I mean, there's no question that people want to live in safe communities, that communities that are people who are living in communities they feel are underprotected, where they're fearful to go out at night, fearful of their neighbors, want and request more protection. Part of the point that we wanted to raise in our op-ed is that even though Black residents are demanding for more law enforcement and harsher punishments as a response to concentrations of crime and violence and illicit markets, informal economies in their communities, these requests for greater police protection were usually accompanied with fierce criticism of police brutality and criminal justice racism. So as you said in your quote, the calls for mandatory minimum sentencing, tough sentencing, were often paired with urgent proposals for jobs and for better schools and for decent health care, and almost always with a real critique of police brutality. I mean, that's the key line in the piece. Residents wanted better policing, not more policing, and what politicians heard was more policing that was in some ways even more aggressive.
Now this was a Democratic bill.
Yes, it was initiated in '93 by Schumer and by Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, as you said.
Did these calls for provisions that would deal with employment and poverty. Were they ever a part of the bill?
Yes, and that's kind of the real tragedy of the bill. Led by the Congressional Black Caucus. I mean, now, Clinton and others have said, well, the CBC, really supported this bill. This isn't our fault. The CBC pushed for prevention funding. They pushed for Head Start and a narrowing of the 3 strikes provision, as well as supporting the assault rifles ban, which does pass. So in their version of the bill, the earlier version of the bill, which doesn't pass, the CBC proposed devoting $2 billion more to drug treatment programs and $3 billion more to youth crime prevention programs. So this again reflects this kind of twinned pairing of calls for better policing, calls for better protection in communities, but a view of that protection that really takes into account prevention programs and social welfare programs, and an expansive definition of prevention that includes early childhood education, Head Start, etc. The other key aspect of the CBC's vision for this bill is that it introduced the Racial Justice Act, which would use statistical evidence of racial bias to overturn death sentences. So the federal government's own Sentencing Commission in 1993 had discovered gross racial disparities in the application of mandatory minimum sentences and the conviction of or death penalty convictions. And the CBC sought to respond to this in the Racial Justice Act and include this in the 94 bill. So essentially the CBC said, okay, if we're going to expand this system, then we really need to reform the fact that Black and Latino citizens are being disproportionately incarcerated under the 3 strikes provision. And then eventually these provisions were scrapped, and this is where some of the Clintons' comments about, their inability to enact their original version of the bill comes in, because Republican legislators like Bob Dole viewed these prevention programs and the Racial Justice Act as pork. Many Republicans in the Senate refused to sign the bill with the Racial Justice Act in tow, and so the bill went on to pass anyway. But in my view, one of the real kind of crimes of this crime bill is that federal policymakers decided to expand and further escalate the prison system and policing, knowing that the system was producing really, really significant racial disparities, that it was targeting Black and Latino Americans, and that Black and Latino Americans, their rights in many respects were being compromised by the ways in which these programs and mandatory minimums were adjudicated and implemented.
Now, 26 of the 38 members of the Congressional Black Caucus at the time did support the legislation.
Yes.
Can you talk to me more about what that process was like after these things that the CBC was supporting to try to get into the bill were taken out, and how that affected people's support?
Right. So Clinton was able to did a major campaign, including having his Black staffers call members of the CBC to try to get them to support the bill when it had its original kind of prevention programs on. At the last minute, he did a little switcheroo and was forced to cut many of these programs, as I mentioned, because of pressure from Republican legislators. So
were they worried about a filibuster in the Senate? Is that what it was?
Yeah, and as we mentioned in the article, many of the CBC members were concerned that if this bill didn't pass, an even more draconian crime bill would eventually pass. They didn't want to necessarily start from scratch, and they were still able, even though the prevention funding that they originally proposed was cut drastically, I think by more than half, there was still some prevention funding in the bill, and they saw this as really one of the only ways that they could get social welfare programs to their constituents. So, for example, Compton's Representative Walter Tucker admitted that he only voted for the bill because of the prevention measures. They disliked the mandatory minimums, etc., but things like the violence against women provisions and the assault on rifles bans that the bill imposed, were meaningful to the CBC, and and they went on to support it. But I don't think that we could classify their supports for the bill as enthusiastic endorsements. I think many of them were very concerned that if this bill didn't pass, something worse might arise in its wake.
12 members of the CBC did not vote for it. Were there any that were very loud about their opposition?
Oh, yes. A number of them, we have that great quote in the op-ed mentioning that basically you wouldn't vote if you're anti-abortion, you wouldn't, simply vote for a bill because it's funding highway construction. Eleanor Holmes Norton admitted that, essentially the prosecutors, because of their racial disparities in sentencing, were essentially in death penalty sentencing, were sentencing blacks to death. I mean, there were a number of representatives who were extremely vocal in their opposition, and two representatives sat out.
Again, we are in conversation with Elizabeth Hinton, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and author of the book From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. In the opinion piece that you wrote, you also said this, quote, selective hearing has a deep history. In the Progressive Era, W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells called for state authorities to offer blacks the same social investment that reformers used to manage crime in white immigrant communities. But while whites received rehabilitation and welfare programs, black citizens found themselves overpunished and underprotected. Can you tell me more about that dynamic, kind of looking at the history of crime in immigrant white communities and what was done there compared to what has been done in black communities?
Right. So immediately after emancipation, we see this is a pattern in U.S. history. When the contours of citizenship expand, we get kind of new forms of criminalization and confinement and new laws that target African Americans. So after emancipation, we get kind of the first mass incarceration in the southern states. We get the convict leasing system, which basically forces newly freed people into a system of labor exploitation that, in many respects, mirrors what they experienced as slaves. And in the North, the associations that social scientists, progressive reformers, and policymakers had made between people of African descent and criminality led to and the targeted enforcement of vice laws, the policing of free black communities, led to their disproportionate incarceration in prisons. As historian Khalil Mohammed, director of the Schomburg Center, has shown in his work, this kind of creates this statistical discourse about black criminality that further justifies and rationalizes the policing, criminalization, and incarceration of black communities. So again, and this is similar to the discourse and ideas that we see today, as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation about super predators. Crime is seen and violence is seen as something that's innate among African Americans that can't be fixed, that it's a result of their pathology and their behavior, whereas progressive reformers treated similar dynamics among immigrant groups who shared many of the same class characteristics with African Americans as something that resulted from their socioeconomic conditions, and that if those conditions were improved, that crime and violence could be addressed and would lessen in Irish communities and Italian communities and Jewish communities, etc. Whereas their approach towards African Americans was consistently punitive. And that's part of our point about selective hearing, and that is that consistently throughout U.S. history, low-income Americans in general, but particularly African Americans, have received greater punishment for crime rather than protection or social welfare programs. And the real kind of beginnings of this emerge in the early 20th century during the Progressive Era, with progressive reformers kind of taking the lead in addressing problems of crime, vice, violence in newly forming early urban communities, newly growing urban communities.
Let's turn to the 1960s, and I think this is also an important decade to think about when understanding what's happening today with policing, and especially in minority communities. In the 1960s, we have Lyndon Baines Johnson's war on poverty and also his push towards a great society. So when we get such legislation as Housing and Urban Development Act, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, but there was also the Law Enforcement Assistance Act and other things. Talk to me the importance of and how you intertwine programs, social programs meant to alleviate poverty with law enforcement.
So March 65, I think, is a really important month. That month, Johnson introduced 3 pieces of legislation that I really see as kind of encapsulating the federal government's response to the civil rights movement. So as you mentioned, the Housing and Urban Development Act, which is the first act he introduces that month, guarantees subsidized housing for low-income renters. And then he introduces the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which for the first time in U.S. history begins a new role for the national government in local police operations, court systems, and prisons. So Johnson broke with 200 years of U.S. history and creates this kind of investment and role for the federal government in crime control, which was unprecedented. And then a week later, he sends the Voting Rights Act to Congress, which kind of completes his civil rights package. For Johnson, the spectrum of these policies, from punitive to the expansion of civil rights and the social welfare provisions, were part of his great society. For Johnson, he saw warring on poverty as warring on crime. He saw poverty as the root cause of crime, but part of what limited his policies is the belief that Johnson and many other policymakers, liberals and conservatives alike, shared, which is that poverty was the result of pathological issues. And this view of poverty as a behavioral problem rather than a structural problem really limited the range of programs of the Great Society and the War on Poverty. So it kind of removed policymakers from structural accountability because they said, okay, well, if poverty is the result of a culture of poverty, as people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was very influential on the administration, said, then we don't need job creation programs. What we need is to train low-income residents in urban and rural areas. We need to provide them equal opportunity programs. We need to provide them remedial education programs. And so there's a disconnect when you're investing in massive job training programs without actually accompanying that with a job creation program. And so many of the socioeconomic problems that had inspired the civil rights movement in the first place, and then later incidents of urban civil disorder or riots, remained and in some ways escalated through the remainder of Johnson's presidency.
I'm going to quote from one of the articles that you've written about this. Johnson declared his hope that 1965 would be remembered not as the apex of American liberal reform, but rather as the year when this country began a thorough, intelligent, and effective war against crime. And you write, a new era in American law enforcement had begun. Was this the federal government creating incentives for local law enforcement to increase policing and surveillance of minority communities?
Yes. So during the experimental period of Johnson's war on crime from 1965 with the Law Enforcement Act until 1968, which is the first major piece of federal legislation, which is the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, essentially, the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance created by the 65 legislation functioned in much the same way as the Office of Economic Opportunity. So Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach and later Ramsey Clark granted local law enforcement directly with experimental funds. So they began to militarize police. You remember that the summer of 1964 witnessed the kind of first bubblings of major urban civil disorder in Harlem, Brooklyn, and then in Rochester, New York, where the National Guard was called, as well as Chicago and Philadelphia. So in some ways, Johnson said, okay, we need to make sure that police are equipped and prepared to handle these types of disturbances. So this, again, much like the 75% off coupon that the Clinton administration gave to states to construct prisons, the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance funds things like riot tanks, things like M1 military carbine rifles, tactical anti-riot squads, etc., at up to 90% of their costs. So they're essentially assuming a new level of investment and responsibility for what they saw as cutting-edge, radical new police programs. This also involved new kinds of experimentation with the kind of functions of police, so police running after-school programs, community policing where police and residents would patrol neighborhoods together, new police recreational programs that were being implemented, new presence of officers in school systems. And then the 68 legislation incentivizes this and kind of forces states to adopt many of these experimental or demonstration programs by forcing states to establish state criminal justice planning agencies in order to receive the new grant funding from the federal government in the via the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 68. So essentially what this does is, regardless of whether or not states wanted to make criminal justice a priority, and many of them did. California was at, as soon as the Law Enforcement Assistance Act passes in 65, California creates its own state criminal justice planning agency, which is actually one of the largest criminal justice planning agencies of any, not surprising maybe given the size and scale of California's criminal justice system today. But if other states, let's say Wyoming, who that might not have wanted to make and to allocate resources to criminal justice, the federal government with this legislation essentially forces states to make crime control an issue and to make crime control a priority and to begin to develop crime control bureaucracies. So we don't often think, a lot of people don't necessarily see the kind of rise of and the expansion of American criminal justice and law enforcement as a federally driven initiative. But this is really significant that these bureaucracies and these kind of crime control planning is being imposed on states by the federal government in 1968. And, by the time Reagan steps into office, when the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration dissolves, the crime control bureaucracies and a larger prison system had been established at the state level. So the federal government took on actually a new role in kind of the direction of law enforcement. And this is why, too, a lot of the kind of commentary on the 94 crime bill has said, well, we really can't, the idea is that Clinton is somehow single-handedly responsible for mass incarceration, and that could not be farther from the truth. And it's very much the product of a long 40-year process, 30-year process that he stepped into.
You see each of these developments building upon one another?
Oh, yes. I mean, I see, we often, part of what inspired this research is that we often kind of see mass incarceration as something that emerges in this policy vacuum, that it's somehow tied just to electoral politics, or that it was kind of the brainchild of Ronald Reagan. And so what my work shows and what history shows is that, mass incarceration is the outcome of a process, in this case a process that's taken a half century, and the outcome of sets of decisions that policymakers made, and not necessarily, kind of this thing that's just orchestrated by a single presidential administration or that just appears out of nowhere.
Again, this claim that if a crime bill was not passed in 1994, there could be something much worse down the road. What were they saying about that? Did they envision Newt Gingrich becoming Speaker of the House, or what are they talking about?
Well, I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, they're from the outset of the war on crime in the 60s. There's ideas about and views of police as being kind of an occupying army, or that the kind of purpose of crime policies is to round up innocent residents and incarcerate them for long terms. And I think that many people worried that that there could be even more prisons, that incarceration rates would continue to rise, that African Americans and black youth in particular would be criminalized even further than they already had. I mean, who knows? There could have been a provision trying to that literally invoked the super predator language. You don't see that in the legislation itself. But you can imagine that, the sentences, they might have changed it to 2 strikes you're out instead of 3 strikes you're out. Or the possibility, I think, from the CBC's perspective, that prevention funding could be cut entirely. And, for these policymakers, the prevention funding was really key in securing their support, because their general approach to crime control, and I think a more effective approach to crime control than one that's been pursued, is one that addresses social welfare needs, that addresses issues of employment, education, housing, etc., rather than just respond to these issues with the escalation of punitive measures.
Looking back at California that you mentioned earlier in the 1960s, and again, just to drive home this point, what we're talking about is coupling social programs meant to deal with poverty with criminal aspects. I mean, you're almost criminalizing poor people here, aren't you?
Exactly.
When you do that?
Exactly.
I mean, we're going to have social programs, but they're going to be administered by the police. I don't know. I mean, that's not exactly it, I guess. But and then looking at how California takes us on head on, is this part of the environment that in which we have the Black Panthers arise?
Yes. So part of what I argue in the book is that, beginning with the Johnson administration, really beginning with the Kennedy administration, Kennedy launched the nation's first anti-delinquency program. This was actually, many of these programs laid the groundwork for the war on poverty. You see kind of the beginnings of Head Start and equal opportunity programs and training programs first emerging in the Kennedy administration as a fight against youth crime, and then they kind of get implemented on a national scale with Johnson's war on poverty. This begins a long process of criminalization, and so this is again why we can't attribute all of these criminal justice problems and mass incarceration to Bill Clinton. Increasingly, during the Johnson administration, once the war on crime is called, crime control programs, law enforcement, and social welfare programs increasingly become entangled and in many cases share funds. So, when Johnson starts Model Cities in 66, 67, he, says this is just as much about improving living conditions in low-income communities as it is preventing crime. So for him, this warring on poverty, warring on crime idea really meant something. He increasingly merged social welfare and social control functions. So by the end of his presidency, you have police taking on new roles in the community. As I mentioned, you have police running after-school programs. You have police working
They're running them.
Oh, yes, yeah. So for instance, in Washington, D.C.
Someone might say, and give you full opportunity to respond to that, but some might say, okay, what we're trying to do is improve the relationship of the police to the community by running these type of programs.
Right, and that was precisely the idea. And there's nothing, there's nothing wrong with police taking on more social welfare roles. But the problem is, and this is something that the Kerner Commission pointed out in its 1968 report, if you're going to have police take on new and different types of roles in the communities, then there has to be major reform and new levels of training within police departments. So even though the Johnson administration empowered police to become kind of a greater part of social services, to become, to have a greater voice in municipal affairs for social welfare programs and community needs, at the same time, these new policies didn't come with new incentives for police themselves. So, the police officer who helps a kid after school ace a spelling test isn't going to receive the same kind of recognition within the department as the police officer who apprehends 5 suspects after a high-speed chase. So, part of it is if we're going to rethink and empower police to take on new roles in the community, then we need to, at the same time, make some transitions and rethink the kind of purpose and function of policing. But you're certainly right. I mean, at the time, part of this was the idea that, okay, residents will begin to accept this influx of police officers in their communities if we can improve the image of police in their communities. One of the major shortcomings of this is that consistently policymakers and local law enforcement really resisted giving residents more of a say and power within police departments as well. So things like civilian review boards that would be able to kind of check police on aggressive practices and brutality were increasingly rejected. Things like tenant patrols. There were a few experimental programs that funded community patrols, and they actually demonstrated significant success in reducing crime, but these programs tended to be consistently underfunded. And so, we can see too, as you mentioned, groups like the Black Panthers arising in 1966 as a response to the kind of new level of policing and police militarization in targeted black communities, and the idea of a separate tenant patrol or real kind of community say and empowerment over police or with police was consistently resisted by law enforcement and by federal policymakers as well.
Yeah, we're in conversation with Elizabeth Hinton. She is assistant professor in the History Department and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of the book From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. Elizabeth Hinton, you referenced the Kerner Commission. This was formed in the late 1960s, created by, I think, Lyndon Johnson. And this was the commission to study and investigate why there was so much unrest around the country. Some people call it riots. Some people call it rebellions. This is the commission that said there are two Americas, one for whites, one for blacks.
Exactly. Yeah, Johnson called the Crime Commission, or the Kerner Commission, in the middle of the Detroit riot, what Detroiters called the Detroit Rebellion of 1967, to investigate the unrest. And the Kerner Commission produced a number of recommendations. The famous line being, our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And the only real recommendations that the federal government adopted that the Kerner Commission provided them with had to do with kind of new policing measures and those recommendations that backed up what Johnson's Crime Commission, which essentially he called in 65 to help him develop a blueprint for the national law enforcement program. He recognized that creating a national or federal law enforcement apparatus would be a significant task, and he wanted a sound piece of legislation that would be amenable to both liberals and conservatives in Congress. So he charges the Crime Commission with investigating crime in America, what he claimed at the time was the largest study of crime ever done. And in the areas where the Crime Commission, the Kerner Commission supported the Crime Commission's recommendations, those recommendations were implemented. The other ones, especially some of its more kind of liberal and transformative notions, were rejected and ignored by the Johnson administration. Again, actually, we could argue this is an example of selective hearing. The administration distanced itself from the Kerner report. But part of what the Kerner Commission suggested, in addition to, as I mentioned, changing the incentive structure in police departments, was a kind of Marshall Plan for American cities. They really emphasized, okay, if we want to deal with these problems of crime and inequality, poverty, we really need to begin a massive investment in American cities. We've got to provide people with jobs. We've got to improve education. They really argued and emphasized the need for kind of fundamental structural transformation. And, the implications of that for Johnson, especially by that point, 68, were far too radical, and Johnson and many other officials in the administration really distanced themselves from the Kerner report. Johnson refused to publicly comment on the report. So even though the Kerner Commission and its report is kind of consistently championed, especially recently, I think shortly after the Ferguson report by the Department of Justice was released in March 2015, people immediately began making comparisons to the Kerner Commission. But the Crime Crime Commission, the commission that Johnson called in '65 that kind of designed the blueprint for the national law enforcement program, really had a much more long-term impact than the Kerner Commission, even though many of the critiques that the Kerner Commission made of the conditions in low-income urban communities were really profound and spot on. They didn't have the kind of legislative impact that the Crime Commission did.
Was there pressure on the Johnson administration to, if you're going to have these Great Society programs or the programs for a war on poverty, then you also better have a war on crime?
I think, we don't like to think that the kind of myth or the ways in which Johnson's call for the war on crime is usually discussed as kind of like this is a reluctant thing. This was his response to Barry Goldwater's campaign in '64, which had proven that the politics of law and order were really that the American public were really kind of open and receptive to these ideas. But I think that Johnson, was truly supported the expansion of national law enforcement. He saw this as yet another one of his contributions to American social policy, that following, his response to the kind of first wave of uprisings in the summer of 1964 is that these were criminal actions, even though, the participants in many of these uprisings shared many of the same grievances as civil rights protesters, and Johnson officials themselves even discussed the extent to which these riots were rooted in socioeconomic conditions, yet the administration still opted to respond with punitive measures ultimately. And I think much of this and Johnson's embrace of crime control policies is really deeply shaped by the set of assumptions that he and other policymakers shared about African Americans and African American poverty and kind of the root causes of African American crime, which he saw as something that was pathological. And increasingly over the course of his presidency, as these uprisings, these riots continue to escalate, Johnson, moved further and further away from some of the more transformative notions of his liberal reform. So, I think this is, he fully believed that the war on crime and that, privileging what he and other policymakers came to call the forgotten civil right to safety was a really important and central aspect of his larger set of domestic policies.
And finally, can you talk to me about Washington, D.C. here in the 1960s? The show does air on WPFW 89.3 in Washington, D.C. At the time, and I think still does, even though, at the time it had a majority African-American population, probably still does, even though like most urban areas, those numbers are starting to change, or have been changing actually. But anyways, back to the point, during the 1960s, kind of a testing ground, wasn't it, Washington, D.C.?
Yes, Washington, D.C. the story of Washington, D.C. is really fascinating. So it was the nation's first city to come into a black majority in the mid-'60s. And, this kind of moment where demographic changes that really kind of materialized in the 60s, the changing demographics of cities. So cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore are edging a third black population as a result of the Great Migration and the exodus of middle class and white families to the suburbs. And D.C. comes into this black majority. And of course, this is where federal policymakers are working. So because of the proximity of D.C. to national policymakers, as you said, it becomes a really important experimental site, beginning with Kennedy's juvenile delinquency program. So because the federal government is able to carefully observe the ways in which these more experimental programs are unfolding. And the idea is, okay, if we use D.C. as a test site, as a guinea pig, then, we can apply these programs elsewhere. So a lot of the kind of first iterations of many of the social programs of the 60s and into the 70s emerge in D.C. During the war on crime, the D.C. Police Department becomes a special focus of the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance and receives I think the single largest grant that the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance gives to put more police officers on the street, to put more police officers on foot and with motor scooters. It also receives kind of the most cutting edge military technology that was available at the time, like walkie-talkies, etc. In the 1970s, under Nixon, D.C. becomes the recipient of one of the kind of most draconian pieces of legislation the Nixon administration passes, which is the D.C. Court Reorganization Act of 1970, which institutes mandatory minimums for the majority black Washington, D.C., pretrial detention, a no-knock provision so that officers can just kind of storm into somebody's house. And this early, we think of mandatory minimum sentences as emerging in 73 with the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, but we see the first instance of them actually being imposed in D.C. explicitly by the Nixon administration. And then after this federal precedent is set, Congress refused to introduce mandatory minimums at that time on a national scale. States then begin to adopt these policies. We also get the beginnings of sting operations in D.C., where Ford's Operation Sting, which involved kind of the collaboration between the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the FBI, and the D.C. Police Department, essentially launched a war on black petty thieves by establishing a underground market where fences could sell stolen goods and then arresting people en masse. I mean, there are so many different stories about, and then after that, stings, proliferate, and we see them really, beginning to arrest people in the thousands during the Reagan administrations. So D.C. is, as you mentioned, it is this kind of key testing site where the federal government can evaluate and study radical and, in many cases, abusive, draconian crime control techniques, sentencing provisions, etc.
Yeah, I was a congressional correspondent 10 years ago when you had a complete Republican-controlled government, George Bush in the White House, and they had both the Senate and the House, and you really saw how they were able to implement what they would like to do for the rest of the country upon D.C., which, of course, is like 90% Democrat. Again, majority African American. So really interesting dynamic that the federal government has to the city. Elizabeth Hinton, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This is great.
Again, Elizabeth Hinton has been our guest. She is an assistant professor in the History Department in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and she's the author of the book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America.